This is a 1995 Ferrari 456 GT, and it's a special car. It doesn't have the exotic look of most other Ferrari models, and that's intentional. It was supposed to be more restrained, more subtle, more elegant, frankly, more beautiful. And I always thought that this is one of the most gorgeous modern Ferrari models of all. The 456 also has a big V12 up front and a gated manual transmission, and today I'm going to review this car and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this Ferrari 456 is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This 456 certainly isn't perfect. It's a driver car, one that you can use and enjoy guilt-free, and it has a gated manual transmission. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this 456, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Ferrari 456, starting with an explanation of what this car is. It's not the low-slung, mid-engine exotic Ferrari sports car you typically think of, and that was intentional. This was the Ferrari you took to a business meeting. This was the Ferrari for the enthusiast who already had a bunch of the sports cars. Maybe he's a little older, a little more grown up, doesn't need to show off anymore, but still wants to drive a Ferrari. You get the 456. And it has back seats, so obviously for more of a family situation. Certainly a more grown-up, mature Ferrari that maybe you're not flexing out in front of the club. Now, despite the relatively restrained styling, make no mistake, this was Ferrari's most expensive car, the flagship, the top of the model line back in the day. This car had a base price of $207,000 before options 30 years ago, and convert for inflation a starting price of around $430,000 for this car back then. It was tremendously expensive, twice as much as an F355, which was the new mid-engine sports car at the time. Now, the design of this car was done by Pininfarina, an Italian design company that created a lot of beautiful Ferrari models over the years. And I have to say, I love how this car looks. It replaced the Ferrari 412, which had gone on in various iterations for many years and, well, wasn't the most attractive car. And after the 456 came the 612, which also was very controversial for its styling, and then the FF, which was even more controversial. The 456 was a beautiful four-seater Ferrari, which is a formula they haven't really been able to replicate, basically before or since. But indeed, a very subtle, understated look, not the Ferrari you'd necessarily stare at or even notice. And it wasn't just the styling that was beautiful. The 456 also had a very impressive powertrain, a big old naturally aspirated V12, a 5.5 liter V12 that made about 435 horsepower. Now, that's not a huge figure by today's standards, but at the time this car came out, that made this the most powerful regular production Ferrari of all time. So this car had some big power from this V12. Now, one thing that I find funny about this engine is that when you get under the hood and look at it, it's not as flashy as a lot of other Ferrari engines that have red painted all throughout, the Ferrari script, a horse emblem right in the center. Instead, it's very subtle, very restrained, very understated, much like the design of the car itself. And in fact, the look of this V12 really perfectly fits with the look of the 456, this understated but special engine for an understated but special car. And one other interesting quirk about this engine, the size of this V12, is how this car was named. So if you take the displacement of this engine in cubic centimeters, so 5,474 cubic centimeters, 5.5 liters, 5474 cubic centimeters, divide by 12, the number of cylinders, the result is 456. Hence the name of this car, the 456. And in fact, this is how almost all vintage famous Ferrari models were named. The 250, the 330, the 365, all the Ferraris from back in the day, they took the displacement in cubic centimeters divided by the number of cylinders, and that gave you the number that became the car's name. It was an interesting convention, and after this car, Ferrari basically completely dropped it, although the Ferrari 488 was also named this way. Most modern Ferraris, though, do not use this naming convention anymore, but the 456 did, and that's a little bit of interesting Ferrari trivia and history. But anyway, next up, onto the exterior quirks and features. I mentioned earlier the design was supposed to be subtle and understated, and this particular 456 is especially subtle and understated. For one, it doesn't have the Ferrari shields on the side, on the front fenders. That would have been an option in this car, but the original owner chose not to get it. It's not really in keeping with the theory of the subtle 456, so it makes sense. Also, this car is green. It's dark green over a beige interior, not your typical bright Ferrari red or shouty yellow, a very understated color choice for a very understated car. With that said, like other Ferrari models of its era, the 456 does have characteristic quad circular taillights in back. As you can see, that was a design element on a lot of Ferraris for a long time and also included on this one. But speaking of lighting, one interesting touch of the 456 had pop-up headlights. You can see, turn them on and they pop up. This was a common design element in sports cars in the late 80s and early 90s, and it even made its way on to the subtle restrained 456, some pop-up headlights. But anyway, next we move inside the 456, where there are quite a few more quirks and features, as you might expect of a 30-year-old Ferrari, starting with the door itself. You open up this massive door. It had to be big to allow front and rear passengers to enter the car, and you can see at the very back of the door there is a vent. Looks like a climate vent, and indeed it is. That's the climate vent for rear passengers. To get access to air conditioning and heat, it flows all the way through the dashboard, through the door, and into that vent, and then it blows on rear passengers for their comfort. A climate vent at the back of the front door. Very interesting. Now, the next thing you notice when you climb inside this car, unquestionably, is the gated manual transmission. 6-speed manual and a V12, a gated manual to V12. What a combination. This car, the early models of the 456, were sold in two versions. There was the 456 GT, that's this car with the manual transmission, or the 456 GT-A, which used an automatic transmission. And it might surprise you to learn that the automatic in this car was a traditional old school torque converter automatic, just like you'd get on basically any other car with an automatic at this time. The automatic predated Ferrari's use of the sequential manual F1 transmission with the paddle shifters or the modern dual clutches. Back then they used a traditional old school automatic in this car and in the 412 that came before it. And I think these are Ferrari's only torque converter autos ever. You might not think Ferrari ever had them, but in fact they did. Thankfully, this car has the gated stick. But anyway, other interesting quirks and features in here. Another one is the stereo head unit, which you can see is branded Ferrari in the corner. I think this is the original factory stereo that came with this car. You don't see these too often anymore. Most people have replaced these by now, but here's what it looked like back when it was new, albeit with some wear since then. Now, in addition to that, this car, being the luxury Grand Tourer Ferrari, had some nice luxury equipment, and that included automatic climate control, as you can see. Set the temperature, and then you can adjust the dials to auto settings for both location and fan speed, and it will automatically control your climate. Although you'll notice that the temperature setting is in Celsius, 18, 20, 22, not Fahrenheit, despite the fact that this is a US car sold new in the US with a miles per hour speedometer. They converted that, but they didn't convert the climate control temperature dial. You just had to figure it out. And some other nice luxury touches. There's a switch here in the center control stack for suspension stiffness, and you can see H and S, which stood for hard or soft, depending on whether you wanted to dial it in for performance or soften it for luxury. You also have heated mirrors here. As you can see, this button would turn on your heated mirror in case they iced over when you were driving your Ferrari in the winter. And another nice luxury, you have 3 center climate vents, which meant that you had one for both front seat people. Maybe you could send one center to the back. It was a nice opulent touch inside this car. But despite all the luxury and the attempts to give people a high-end, high-quality experience, this car had some weird things like you'd expect from a Ferrari in this era. For example, this switch in the center control stack opens up the trunk, and in fact, that's the only way to open the trunk. So if you're approaching this car with some large item you want to stick in the trunk, you can't just push a button on the key fob or twist a key in the keyhole. Instead, you have to unlock the door, open it, reach inside, flip this switch, get back out, walk over there, then open up the trunk and put in your thing. Not exactly the most convenient. Also weird, how about the fact that this car is turned off completely, and yet the gauges are sitting at 500 RPM on the tachometer and roughly 16 miles an hour on the speedometer. Even though the car is off and obviously not moving, that was the resting position for the gauges, and that was Italian craftsmanship in this era. That gives you an idea of what their tolerances were for parts all throughout the car. Also, here's another unusual quirk. Like a lot of cars, the headlights are on the turn signal stalk coming off the steering column. You just twist it and the headlights turn on. Same's true of the high beams, but not the parking lights, which are located here in the center console with their own dedicated silver square button completely far away from all of the other light controls in this car. That's definitely odd. And another odd one, how about the fact that also in the center console, you have these strange storage trays. They're too shallow for you to put anything in there and have it stay, or really place anything meaningful inside, but they're there. 4 different storage trays that serve no apparent functional purpose. Now, thankfully, because this is the luxury Ferrari, there's more storage in here than just this. You also have the glove box, which is fairly large, and a bit of a surprise because a lot of cars like this don't have a glove box. This one does. Now, unfortunately, you did not get any storage on the door panel. There's no door pocket where you can put papers or a wallet or anything while you're driving. Most cars have that, but unfortunately, for some reason, this one did not. Another unusual Ferrari decision. Also, an unusual decision is the sound of the horn, which, well, take a listen. But anyway, next up we move on to the back seats, which are important for this car because it really was intended to be a grand tourer with the back seats seeing occasional use. That was what separated this car in part from other Ferrari models, and that's why they stuck the climate vent on the back of the door, and there were some other amenities in the back seats as well. Specifically, you can see they are individual bucket seats back there and completely cloaked in leather. High-end, high quality, even for the rear passengers. In fact, this interior in general is a lot of leather. Not just the seats, the dashboard, but also the headliner. It's all leather in here. Very beautiful, high-end, high quality, not a lot of skimping on any materials. But anyway, back to the back seats. You also had a few nice features, as I mentioned. The climate vents on the backs of the front door, but also an armrest between the 2 seats, and it lifted up for storage so you could put stuff there. And of course, you also had an ashtray. So there were some nice comfort and convenience features, some thought for the rear seat passengers. Of course, as you can see, 2 individual rear bucket seats here. You don't have a 3rd center seat, making this car a 4-seater. Also worth pointing out that the back seats have individual reading lights, as you can see, and if you're sitting back there, you push a button and you can turn on the reading light for the left or right side. Now, an odd choice, there's also a dome light above the rear seats, but you can't turn it on in the back. You press this button here up front in the center control stack, this switch, and that turns on the rear seat dome light. Apparently, rear passengers could not be trusted to turn on the dome light themselves. And finally, we move on to the trunk in the 456. And again, to access the trunk, I push that switch in the center control stack because there's no other way. And then you come back here and you can open it up, where you discover that the trunk is, reasonably sized for an exotic car, maybe a little small for the luxury grand tourer, but there's a decent amount of space back here where you can put stuff. The trunk is also completely carpeted, not just the bottom and the back, but even the underside of the trunk lid. So whatever you have back here, it's going to be in a nice carpeted environment, not bouncing around with metal and bodywork getting damaged. Also, if you lift up this lower portion of the trunk, you will notice some extra storage under here, although I suspect originally there was probably a spare tire here, maybe even a tool set, but not the case in this car, although the extra storage certainly doesn't hurt. Now, the other interesting item in this trunk, you can see over on the left side, there's a hump here, blocks a lot of space, and if you lift open this panel, you can see it's a 10-disc CD changer that is Ferrari branded. That was a hot item in 1995. CDs were just starting to show up. This car didn't just have a CD player, but a 10-disc. That gave you an idea of just how luxurious the 456 really was. So, on to our final 456 thoughts. This car was made throughout the 1990s, from 92 to 2003, and there were basically two versions, the original 456 and later an updated model called the 456M, which had some subtle changes, although no additional power under the hood. But despite 10 years of production, the 456 is tremendously rare. Ferrari only built about 3,300 units of this car over a decade. That makes it rarer than my 05 Ford GT. In 2 years, they built over 4,000 of those. So this is a really special, really uncommon car. And if you assume most people want a manual, only about 2/3 of these were made with the manual transmission. So that makes it rarer still. A third of production was with the automatic. And half of the 456Ms were automatics compared to half manuals. Now, the other interesting thing about the 456 is that throughout its production run, some, let's just say, rather interesting versions of this car were made. There were several different odd variants, but the strangest was undoubtedly the Station Wagon model. It was called the 456 Venice, and it was reportedly commissioned by the Sultan of Brunei, although he did not take delivery of all of the Venice models. And so the 456 Venice, there's a couple of them out in the wild. Apparently, some people own them, and they're driving around in a factory-built Ferrari station wagon. This was Ferrari's first ever wagon. It was a very rare four-door Ferrari. They don't really make four-door cars, but they made this as a special commission based on the 456. Certainly one of the quirkiest cars Ferrari made in this era, in addition to the relatively quirky 456 in general. But anyway, with all of that said, very curious to take this out and see how it drives. The V12 with the gated manual, the subtle 90s Ferrari. Time to get behind the wheel. All right, driving the 456. This is a special moment for me because this was a car I idolized as a kid. I thought the 456 was incredibly beautiful. I still do. It has aged in a way that it's starting to look pretty dated, but I think the styling will eventually come back and this will be viewed as a real classic special car. But at the time, it was absolutely a gorgeous Ferrari, and they were making a lot of gorgeous cars. The 550 was also out. It was a special time in the Ferrari world. And I gotta say, this particular one, there are some, I like driver cars. And this car has some issues. It's been hit and repaired. The suspension light's on. Like, the paint's not great, but like, I love cars like this that you can just use and not feel guilty about putting on miles or about parking it. You know, I love my Carrera GT, but I've stopped driving it to like dinners, for example. You can't park it in a parking lot. You spend the whole dinner anxious about the car. This car, it would just be so cool to daily a gated V12 Ferrari. And in this car, you absolutely could do that guilt-free without worrying about miles or wear and tear because someone else has already put on miles and already worn and torn. So how does it drive? Well, to shift gears in a gated manual in a V12 is just a tremendously special experience. I mean, it's so cool to roll your own gears in a 12-cylinder engine. To just feel that level of torque and power. There is a monster under there and you're doing it all yourself, and that is so cool. And I gotta say, given this car's kind of flaws and faults, I wasn't really expecting it to drive incredibly well. However, at least from an engine and transmission perspective, it is actually pretty strong. It's really not problematic. It feels strong, it pulls well, and the shifter and clutch action is great. The shifter is heavy, like unusually heavy, and I wasn't really expecting that, / didn't really realize that was the situation in the 456, but that is the situation. You do have a pretty heavy clutch. Pushing it down is not the easiest thing in the world. And of course, I do love the gate. Even though the clutch is hard to push down, shifting in the gate is just such an absolute joy of an experience. In this interior, it's nice. There's a lot of leather everywhere, and the interior is actually held up. Despite the flaws of the car, the interior is actually held up exceptionally well. The leather looks good. The dashboard doesn't have any real leather shrinkage, a little bit around the airbag cover, but everything in this interior is in pretty nice shape. The buttons aren't even sticky. This car has done okay in terms of condition in some areas. The steering is pretty nice and pretty heavy, and it feels good. It's kind of well positioned, well controlled, predictable, easy, and just heavy enough to feel like you're doing it, like you're getting good feedback. I also really love this powertrain. Oh, it feels strong. Brakes are good. Brakes stop this car quickly. This does not feel like the vintage car that it is starting to become in people's minds. It feels a lot more modern than that. You have a good, responsive, real powertrain, and it really does move pretty well. This is a surprisingly athletic car. For the GT 4-seater large Ferrari, you think they make those for long distance, high speed cruising, and they do. But this one is actually kind of set up for some fun driving, and I'm surprised at how good the steering feels. I'm surprised at how responsive the powertrain is, and even the chassis and the handling. I'm surprised the car is just so athletic and agile. This is a pretty impressive car. Everybody talks about the 550, including me, being such a special, iconic, amazing. Oh, wait a minute. The 456 has all that and 2 back seats. This car is fun. I mean, ringing it out, this is like a fun experience. It's a great powertrain, and it is a quick, agile, easy to move around car. This is an underrated vehicle. Absolutely. I'm really impressed with this. You can hustle this, and it hustles. This is not bad. Who knew? The 456 is actually a fun car to toss around. There's a lot more to like here than I really expected there would be, and I have a lot of positive things to say about it. I'm into this car. I'll take a 456. Woohoo! Yeah! This is nice. This is a fun car to drive, a legitimately fun car to drive. Not just a car with big power, not just, it has a gated V12, but it's all engine. No, this is a well-balanced total package car, which I just really was not expecting. And so that's the Ferrari 456 GT. Beautiful lines, a big V12, a gated manual transmission, and massive depreciation. And you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. For now, it's time to give this Ferrari a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 49 out of 100, which places the 456 here against some sort of similar cars, although truthfully everything on this list is newer than the 456, and most of these cars are more exotic and high performance, like the Lamborghini Diablo and the Mercedes SLR. Truthfully, there's not much to compare the 456 to, but I really enjoyed driving it. It was a lot more exciting than I expected, and it's always a joy to shift gears in a V12.